Kia ora koutou. Welcome back, team. Hello, everybody. So lovely to see you. Hello, George. Lovely to see you too.
G'day, mate.
Good day, mate. Back again for another week of Big Hairy News. Officially, this is episode number 95, which means next Monday is episode 100. That's right, isn't it? 95, 96, 97, 98. Friday will be 99. Yep. Then next Monday is episode 100 of our little soft launch of this product that, you know, slowly but surely, more and more of you seeming to be enjoying. So good to be back with you. Good to have you back, George. Haven't seen you for a few days. Everything going well? How's your world?
Yeah, nothing much to report.
Yeah. Tell me this, as someone who's had COVID,
yeah,
are you doing anything any differently now? Like, are you being more cautious to try and avoid getting it again, or are you living exactly as you were before you'd gotten? Like, you were being careful anyway, but are you living exactly as you were pre to getting it?
Yeah, some of my circumstances have changed, but in terms of how I act, pretty much the same. If not more. Well, you know, last time I said I went and watched the rugby in a very tight sort of close thing.
Yep.
Made the decision not to do that and specifically go to a different place this time around. So those sorts of things where I sort of catch myself, you know, but nah, it's all.
I have seen on Facebook 6 people I know who were at the rugby on Saturday night be positive by today. Now, is that going to be enough time? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just coincidental, but I was thinking, gosh, that's interesting that they happened to be in that space at that time and then showed positive signs today to Monday. So that's 48 hours later. That feels a bit early saying that out loud, but maybe it is. But I don't know. Anyway, yeah. So crazy time around the whole country. Crazy time in the South Island. Hohepa Thomas, otherwise known as the Hori, the artist and Māori activist, was going to be on the show tonight. He's driving to Dunedin today. He was driving between Christchurch and Dunedin, and he tows a big trailer with a big A-frame on it because that's part of his Hori's pledge to go up against Hobson's pledge. And I think the winds were too much, and they literally couldn't because of the, you know, moving the stuff around. So I think they hold up in Ashburton or something. So, I've been up at a friend's house today who lost a 30-foot tree down in the front yard. It's been just a crazy time around the whole South Island, actually. So I don't think it's been quite as like that in the North Island, has it? But down here, bottom half of the South Island especially, it's been madness, the winds. And I got out of the car today at my friend's house who's the tree's down, and I almost couldn't pull the door back shut. Like, it was like I took the dog with me to run the dog at the park, and I couldn't. It was too windy to go across the road to the park to throw the ball. It was like not hurricane force, but whatever is the maximum of sort of that normal high point of wind. It was that, then maybe plus another kilometer per hour. It was just madness, man.
Yeah. It was very good to finally see the sun on Saturday. Me and a mate went down for the Otago Racing Car Club. What are they called? Otago Car Club Racing Car. Well, anyway, they put on a rally sprint, which is basically just a single stage rally near Waihola, which was very fun. We went to a corner out there, kind of Milton, Waihola sort of way. And the cats just jumped through the window. You know, it was just perfect. It was like, you know, that week long of just pissing down had finally stopped, and we were able to watch some cars get sideways, some old Ford Escorts and all that kind of thing rip around the little dirt tracks around there.
Yeah, no, the weather was shocking. I had a leak in the roof, and I phoned a roofing people, and they went, "We've had 35 calls this morning." I was like, "Oh, okay, thank you." So, but it's fine. It was a little, sometimes when you got corrugated iron roof, it just gets up a little edge. No matter what you can do, you can't stop it. So it's fine. Hey, Politikiwi has asked about the Discord. We're looking at that and stuff this week. Politikiwi, if I can get something sorted, or if we can get something sorted by next Monday being our 100th show, we will. So stick around. We will we'll do what we can. Look, let me put it this way. At the 100th episode mark, I guess we're going to reassess what we're doing. I feel like we've got a few more months in us to see how this all goes. I don't personally, everything is coming out of my back pocket to run this thing. I don't want to make a massive investment financially in something if this is not going to be around in 6 months' time. But our plan is to have something where you guys can interact more easily, be it Discord. I know there's not a big charge to Discord, but it's also time in that, be it Discord, be it actual phone lines coming in. I'm talking to a company about that this week, or something. So we're onto it. We're looking at it. It's a part of what we're doing. But anyway, look, very quickly, back to the rugby, which you started with. What an amazing game. As I said last week with Chewy, mother's name was Mulligan. My name's Patrick. No losers for me on Sunday night. My mum will be sitting in the Irish pub in the Sky, looking down, being pretty stoked for what probably actually went on. Although she wasn't born in Ireland, she was born here, but her parents are straight out of Belfast. And it was an amazing result for them. Horrific for the All Blacks. And I got to say one thing, and I'll bring this up. This is a tweet I put out I tend to tweet during All Blacks games. This is one that I put out on Saturday night, just for people who are rugby fans. Say what you want about, because everyone's jumping up and down Foz at the moment on the coaching, all right?
Yeah.
So say what you want about the coaching, but coaching has nothing to do with dropped balls, knock-ons, missed kicks, poor throw-ins from the All Blacks. Going to lose. This was actually just before they scored their last try of the first half. Going to lose this if they don't get their basic skills back under control. So look, respectfully and I was a bit annoyed actually to hear a lot of people talking about, how embarrassing this was with the All Blacks. You actually got outplayed by a superior team. Yeah. That's the first thing. You got nailed and smashed by a superior team. Yes, you could have played better, but I don't know if you could have beaten them even if you played a lot better. All Blacks have had 15 good minutes of rugby in this 3-test series, and that's how they won the first test match. Other than that, I would say that the Irish have either matched them for the rest of the time or bettered them. So I think Irish well deserved to win this. And yeah, I don't like hearing, it's almost like this, all the news on Sunday morning and this morning about the rugby was like, oh, we did so poorly, we should have smashed them. It's like, no. You did. Part of the game of rugby in all sport is you can only play as well as the opposition lets you. And if they don't let you play, and if you don't have the skill set to actually, fight against what they're trying to do, then they're just a better team. So I don't know if any All Black team with the current squad and coaching panel could have beaten that Irish team. So it was pretty cool, actually. I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Yeah, no, it was, for someone like me with, hardly any skin in the game, just sort of getting caught up in the atmosphere of hanging out with a whole bunch of people and watching a game and having it, as opposed to the second one, have the All Blacks sort of seem like they were getting something together in the second half and have those moments, those runaway tries and that sort of thing. It's fun when you're getting on the piss with a bunch of people.
Oh, and look, the other thing about the rugby in general is the current laws about contact at the head and stuff are ridiculous. Yes. We want to keep player safety in place, but I think I've shown the tweet I sent out numerous weeks ago before is that, head-on-head contact is not always a red card. And ironically, in the second test match, head-on-head contact was a red card for us, but head-on-head contact was not a red card for Ireland in the third one. So that inconsistency doesn't work either. A red card is for like dirty play, foul play, actual purposeful rule breaking and dangerous play, not an accidental head-on-head. So there needs to be some cleaning up done with the rules as well. But in saying all of that, that wouldn't have changed the result. Like that wouldn't, let's make it clear, that wouldn't have changed the result. So there's no kind of crying foul anybody because we were done out of something because of a few decisions. The All Blacks were smashed. And Irish were deserved winners. Top of the morning to you. All right, let us talk about tonight. So tonight we've got Michael Woodhouse coming on. Michael Woodhouse, former Minister of the Crown, current opposition MP. He is a Dunedin local as well. He's the list party member for Dunedin for National. He is going to be, well, he has already joined me. I've already spoken to him. So that interview is coming up in the second part of the hour. The reason I asked Michael if he wanted to have a chat was around the announcement today around inflation at 7.3%. And we often talk about what the politicians are saying. Like we'll show a clip of something and we'll talk about what they've said, and it was just an opportunity to talk to someone about it. And look, we have had, Labour on, and we've had Greens on maybe 3 times. We've had ACT on, we've had the Māori Party on. We've never had National Party MP on. So I'm like, let's have them on. I always, when I'm inviting, especially a politician on, like I did it with David Clark as well, I was like, this is what we're talking about. And obviously they have a desire to stay on topic and on task. And that was about the grocery czar. And I said to Michael, we're talking about inflation. Now, we did kind of go around the place a little bit here and there, but it was a good conversation and he enjoyed it at the end. But, there's pushback and there's questions. And the good thing about it from my perspective is I think Michael will come back when we want to talk about some other things. It basically turned into a longer conversation than it should have been. And towards the end of it, there was more and more things coming up and I could have gone for double the time again. So it's not that there's not pushback from me on things I disagree with. It is a opportunity to book him in again and go a bit deeper into some of the other things that we just didn't have time on for today. So, all right, let's have a look. Speaking of National, I want to have a look at an article written by Hayden Munro in the New Zealand Herald. Now, Hayden Munro was the campaign manager for Labour's 2020 election win. He now works in corporate PR in Wellington for a firm called Capital Communications and Government Relations. He has written an article in the Herald. It's behind the paywall. If you want to check it out, go to the nzherald.co.nz and get yourself $1.99 a month or whatever it is, or a week for paywall. And it's entitled Hayden Munro, Christopher Luxon's Foot in Mouth Business Faux Pas. We touched on this last week, but I think Hayden spells out some interesting thoughts around this. And we're going to use a mixture of what he's got to say, maybe some reflection on some other conversations with Christopher Luxon, and also some audio from RNZ as well. So, read you some parts of Hayden's article. What was he thinking, says Hayden? A common question to ask when politicians put their foot in their mouths. But Christopher Luxon's decision on his recent trip overseas to criticise New Zealand's businesses for, quote unquote, getting soft is a particular head scratcher. It is a head scratcher because, National say that they're the party of business, the party of small business. And to tell a group of business people in the UK that, back home businesses are soft, yeah, it's peculiar. It's a peculiar angle or a stance to take. And you'll hear as we go through Mr. Luxon saying things like he's talking about what the government's doing to business, but that's not what the comment was. The comment was directed at business. It wasn't directed at the government. And you'll hear it because we're going to play the comment. We've got a copy of that off RNZ. There's the obvious why on earth would you say that element. It's not a great look for any politician to go overseas and try and talk our country business sector down. It was an unflattering contrast to Jacinda Ardern's recent wins for New Zealand overseas, landing major trade deals for our exporters, winning new rights for Kiwis in Australia, and getting rave reviews from business leaders for championing their cause offshore. Anything you want to add into that yet, George?
No.
Hayden goes on to say, because it's been a week now and Luxon's done a number of interviews trying to clean up his comments, it's always telling, and he says it in the audio we're going to play you with, whether it's a politician or a comedian, when they say, look, what I meant was, if you have to say those words, look, what I meant was, then there's a hole in your narrative. Like, I'm not saying that what you've said is wrong, but if you have to explain what you've said, just like if a comedian has to explain their joke, then your communication has missed the mark on some level, whether you're wrong or whether it's just been done poorly. So he's done a series of interviews explaining what he meant by it. Maybe Luxon was just voicing the traditional small government idea that major government interventions in the economy, like a wage subsidy, actually just prop up businesses that would go under in a free market and are so bad for the economy in the long term. But no, National and Luxon have always been supportive of the wage subsidy. Hayden goes on to talk about an interview that Mr. Luxon then did on Morning Report. And we are going to play some of that interview so you can hear the actual audio from the UK and what Susie Ferguson had to say to Christopher Luxon about the situation.
National Party leader Christopher Luxon is back from a 10-day overseas mission, scouring for policy ideas from Singapore, Ireland and London. Here he is speaking to the right-wing think tank Policy Exchange in London last week.
What we need is just more consistent microeconomic reform around just unleashing enterprise, because we've kind of got into a place where the public look for the government for all their answers, but now businesses are getting soft and looking for the government for all their answers too, when in fact we want to have that entrepreneurship and that enterprise to be unleashed within New Zealand.
And Christopher Luxon joins us.
So
Unleash the enterprise.
That's very clear. That's actually saying businesses are doing poorly and they've got their focus in the wrong place. So it's a criticism of the business. There's no question about that, because it says what it says is the government has done this for the businesses, but now the businesses are looking back to the government too much. So it is definitely a criticism of business. I think that's unequivocal from what has been said in that speech.
It's now kia ora.
Morning, Susie. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. Now, businesses are getting soft, you say. People will have heard that in the clip. Why are you dunking on New Zealand business overseas?
Well, what I'm saying there very clearly is that we have some great innovation and great creativity and great entrepreneurship in New Zealand, but we've frankly got a government that's actually not recognising that business actually needs to be empowered and actually get out and do things.
So the spin now is that he's criticising the government, but it's unequivocal that that's not what he did in the speech. It's unequivocal. It's unchallengeable. Now, I'll say again, if I was being really fair, I might just say he might argue that he misspoke, and that's what he meant was to put more of the blame on the government. But what he actually said wasn't that in the speech to the quote unquote right wing think tank.
The world, and it was in the context of a policy speech where we're talking about how we actually make New Zealand wealthier and more productive, and really what we want to do is, but we've got a government that frankly adds cost, compliance, red tape, doesn't support small, medium enterprises whatsoever, and makes their job incredibly hard. And so we want those companies growing, because that's how we create jobs, that's how we create higher wages.
Well, you do say, though, that businesses are getting soft and are looking towards government for the answers. Aren't businesses busting themselves right now?
Well, we want to make sure that our New Zealand businesses are actually out exporting in the world. So what we have in New Zealand is, over 30 years is what we call a productivity challenge. And essentially what that means is that we need to create a much more pro-business environment so that businesses actually invest to grow. But at the moment, the government keeps changing the rules, keeps throwing cost and compliance at them, and people aren't.
So again, the spin is he's criticising the government. Now, look, he's leader of the opposition. He's entitled to, probably right to criticise the government. No, the criticism from me is not on him criticising. The criticism is that's still not what he said.
Investing. We want more New Zealand.
That's not what you were saying, though, Mr. Luxon. You were saying quite clearly that businesses were getting soft. So why did you say that?
What we want to make sure is that government and business and community are the three big actors in our society. We want them all empowered. But what we've got is a government that doesn't understand or get business, and we want more New Zealand firms to export.
None of that is what you said, Mr. Luxon. You said quite clearly that businesses were getting soft.
What I meant was that businesses need to be able to go out and...
What I meant. So as soon as a politician utters that from wherever they are on the political spectrum, what I meant means that their actual messaging has missed the mark.
2 minutes into the interview.
either, and look, I'm being fair here. When I say miss the mark, either they are wrong, that's one of the options, or what they meant to say has been packaged poorly and interpreted a different way, right? So maybe he was meaning on criticizing the government, but the messaging hasn't worked, so he's having to re-explain it, which is what Hayden's article was talking about.
To the world and build their expertise and knowledge, because the best firms are the globally successful firms that are scaled. In New Zealand, we really struggle with actually that. We only have really Fonterra and probably Fisher and Paykel Healthcare that are globally scaled. And we want to see more firms like we saw in Ireland, where they really encourage their businesses to get out and export. And the government has really pro-business policies to encourage people to do that.
Where does New Zealand sit in the ease of doing business index that the World Bank produces?
Historically, New Zealand's been a good place for business, but as you would have seen
number one.
As you would have seen in recent times, things like competitiveness and other things, economic management and performance have actually dropped in recent surveys around the world. And
so
what's
even though we
interesting-
sit at number one, it's too hard.
It's good that we've got a good open environment. That's historically what we've had, but under this government, I can tell you in the last 4 years, it's getting really tough to do business, and businesses don't want to make the investment they need to make to grow their businesses.
Well, that doesn't seem to be reflected in the World Bank table, which has New Zealand at number one.
Yes, and there's other components of that, Susie, in terms of other attributes.
So that's
like
we'll leave the interview there because it continues on, but you get the gist of what's being said. Hayden talks about that, Mr. Luxon, then having the position that over the last wee while it's gotten bad. It's been good in the past, but it's gotten bad. So this is what Hayden goes on to say in his article. In the past 12 months, New Zealand's exports were up by 11% to 80 billion, literally the highest amount on record. In fact, since 2017, our physical exports actually selling products overseas has increased by 36%. That's a great result for Kiwi businesses who have been doing it so tough during the pandemic. It's especially impressive when you consider that tourism, one of our biggest export earners, has been hit so badly with the borders closed. It seems to me that, this is to Hayden, it seems to me that the most likely explanation is that Luxon was just playing to the crowd, a conservative British audience, and got carried away trying to attack the government, which is sort of what we were saying. Hayden goes on, and not to go through the whole story, to talk about doing this and how well businesses have been doing this tough times, and says this: no one who's been paying attention would call those people, the people who have been going through businesses, soft. So I guess implying that that Mr. Luxon's not paying attention. Finishes it up by saying, talking about kind of this nipping by Christopher Luxon, in my words, but Hayden's perspective. But overdo it, and as Luxon found out this week, you'll end up saying things totally out of touch with what's really happening. And if you find yourself doing that to a foreign audience, don't be surprised if it rubs people up the wrong way back home. George?
Yeah, there seems to be a pattern here, and it's not just indicative of Christopher Luxon, but also, I guess, a process that the media goes through where it is able to sort of catch the politician in the act of miscommunicating or whatever and hold their feet to the fire when it comes to that, right? Just like with the crisis conversation, it's similar there. But yeah, with Christopher Luxon as well, that he's constantly having to sort of explain these things. Remember the whole like bottom feeders thing, and then there was like the going to find some tip top Maori or something like that. These sorts of, it wasn't tip top, but it just sounds funny, so I chose it. But yeah, there's these sorts of constant sort of cleanup jobs, right, that he has to do.
Yeah, well, that's the foot and mouth, isn't it?
And yeah, and it comes like that's confusing though as well. Like talking to some British conservative think tank about it, because is he saying that the businesses, this word getting used, whatever that means, businesses, New Zealand businesses, what does he mean, like Fonterra, or what is he talking about?
Yeah,
soft, in that they haven't sort of fought back against the government, whatever that means, right? And then I'm here to lead them in their fight against red tape
and their revolution.
Yeah.
I will be the revolutionary leader. Yeah, and look, I think I think perhaps one of the commentaries that was talking about, Paul says high caliber Māori. Was that the word you were looking for?
Yeah.
I think that the idea of playing up to the audience makes the most sense, But I also think that it doesn't make sense to me, this thing about, okay, so here's the thing, right? And let's have this as a repetitive theme. We get told so often that small business, like by National, that small business is the cornerstone of our economy. That Americans say mom and pop businesses, but small business. Yet in this interview, his complete focus is on growing businesses to be exporters. Like that's not what small business is. So which is it? Is it that is National going to be the party of big business, i.e. Fonterra, the tax cuts, that kind of stuff, and fuck the small ones? Or are they going to be the party of small business, which is sort of what they have been, not to negate the big business, but that's one of their things that, like, we will help small business. And that's actually also not the people that he was talking about need to push back against the government, because he was talking about we want to grow all our businesses to be these world exporters like in Ireland, which was a hugely failed opportunity, that all these businesses came into Ireland, and there was the GFC, and all of those businesses just absolutely exploded and went bankrupt. So I don't know if he's talking about that part of moving into Ireland or since 2008 and moving forward. But I don't, there's mixed messaging there. And as I said, I've said it twice already. As soon as you say, hang on, let me explain what I meant, it's over. You've lost, the conversation's gone, because that's not how a headline works. Luxon says this, but what he actually meant was that's not a headline. That doesn't work. Whether he was right or wrong, as soon as you say what I meant was, it's like, okay, so the opposing party has all the power here.
I love when audio gets leaked from a think tank talk or whatever, like a Hillary Clinton, speaking tour. It reminds us of the sort of multifunction of politicians that, at the end of the day, they're going on these sort of waffly talking tours where they, because, you listen to what he's saying there. It's not very robust, right? It's more of a, there's a sort of he's sending out a vibe to his British counterparts, right? He's he's sort of he's playing, he's performing. Obviously,
he's probably also lining up.
Controversial thing to say.
Probably lining up for post political life to be the CEO of British Airways or something. Maybe that's what he's doing, making some connections.
Yeah.
Remember Helen Clark? Everyone was saying, "Oh, all she's doing is just so she can get a job in the UN afterwards. That's the only reason she's doing what she's doing. Is just so she can go and be the Secretary General of the UN." So, well, okay, let's flip that and now say, well, for a politician who's actively said, "I turn businesses around," maybe that's what he's doing. Apples with apples. If she was going for the UN, he's maybe going for a airline CEO job in the UK post his political life. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, because Secretary General is known as such a such a great job. It's not, you're not totally put over the fucked basically by the world, or disrespected on a daily basis, and your whole sort of organization is just seen as another joke.
Now, Paul has said here that he opened with a Māori greeting. Just correct me, Paul. Are you saying that was at the UK think tank? Because if that's the case, then you guys know what I've been saying about Mr. Luxon and his Māori greetings, that he seems to refuse to do it in New Zealand, even though he claims to be a student of Te Reo. But that would be really interesting if he refuses to do it in New Zealand, but he did it in the UK. It's kind of like all those people who are like, oh, no, Māori culture. And then when they get to the UK, they're like, oh, huck at this and huck at that. This is all it is. Like they
didn't use the opportunity to respond to Susie's Māori greeting with his own.
No. Well, that's what we've said. All I want people to do is show me where he's used the student of today, which he has acknowledged himself as, using a Te Reo greeting at any stage in any interview you've ever heard him in New Zealand. Because I still haven't heard it. And I just think it's weird. Like if you're a student of whatever, George, you're a student of F1. So do you completely ignore that and remove it from your life, or do you integrate it into your life because you're a student of that thing? You tend to bring it into your life.
It's very Air New Zealand, right, to say you're a student of Te Reo and then not use it ever. It's very. It is, as you say. It's the millennial on their OE in London, and they're sort of sort of talking all these colourful stories about the natives back in New Zealand.
Note the lack of denial. He isn't even turning around and saying he misspoke. Yeah, he didn't actually say that. You're right. Or that he doesn't think New Zealand businesses are soft. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. Also, Simple says he hated that interview as she took him to task on his statements. Good effort. There's other ones coming in as well. Okay, so we'll keep an eye on that. And look, not to overload you too much with one political perspective tonight, but we have an interview coming up just in a few minutes with Michael Woodhouse, local Dunedin MP, a former Minister of Immigration, Honourable Michael Woodhouse. And we wanted to talk to someone about inflation tonight. And I thought, it's about time we get a national party, a Tory. And look, let me just say to you as well, if you're wondering what we do, and some people kind of accuse us of being a socialist propaganda movement. Thank you, by the way. We have approached every political party basically equally. And some say yes, some say go fuck yourselves. So that's just so we go to everybody all the time if the story warrants it. Speaking of stories, this kind of came out with the inflation story as well. It's about cost of living, but it's specifically to do with students. Now, George, you've worked in and around Otago University. Be interesting to get your take on this. But basically, see that big 56% there? That's to do with how much students are spending purely on their accommodation. So let's have a listen to this, have a quick chat about it, and then we'll head off to Michael Woodhouse.
Back to uni for these students in Auckland, and it's not easy.
I'm broke right now. Working 2 jobs right now, and it still feels like too much.
Now laid out in black and white.
Here it is.
A report she says is proof students are in poverty.
2/3 of students being unable to afford the basics regularly is one that should really drive home to people just how dire this situation is.
And rent?
Students on average are spending 56% of their income.
That's what it is in Wellington. Students reporting average income of $462 a week and average rent of $261. In Auckland, a little higher, $470 of average weekly income and $266 going out on a place to live. 57% of their money going on rent there.
It's never been this tough.
I think my current food weekly expense, I'm trying to limit it to $20.
Doesn't matter if it's a rite of passage, doesn't matter about any of those things. Why should we allow people to live in poverty when we can do something about it?
The report offers up ways to do that. One, letting everyone get a student allowance.
That it would cost approximately $2.5 billion a year.
Other recommendations include better mental health support and free public transport.
It's getting hard to pay for on the daily basis, so yeah.
The report says students with disabilities are finding study even harder.
It's time for us to actually get the appreciation we deserve.
The government says it's lifted student allowances and student loan living costs and helped bring in a new code of care. It says it's done more than the government before it. But back to this report saying it's not enough.
And the government can't hide from these facts any longer.
For students, there's no hiding either. Kim Baker-Wilson, One News.
I love how they went through that. It's like a story about spending money on rent, and they talked about more mental health things and raising student allowance and student allowance being allowed for everyone, which is good because means testing is not. I don't really think it's the best way of doing things. I think there should be a universal chance to have student allowance, but they didn't talk about housing or anything in that. And I'm sure that the Greens report does.
But they were talking about 57% of their weekly income going on housing. What do you mean they weren't talking about housing? What have I missed?
In terms of the remedy seemed to be still pay that much, or still pay what we're paying in rent, still pay the 400 or whatever it was, but just subsidise, landlords with government money.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
I wonder if they could do anything about housing. This is one of the things, and we're about to play the Michael Woodhouse conversation, and I didn't get a chance to get into this, but I asked him about the $50 a week, $150 a week rent that's gone up under Labor that Mr. Luxon talked about several months ago, and that is being talked about again now, how to fix that. And he came up with, landlords and bright line tests and that kind of stuff. But I didn't get a chance to ask him this because it was right at the end and we'd been going for too long. I said, but do you think if you remove all those things, all of a sudden those landlords are going to drop their rents? Of course they're not. That's what the rents are. I mean, how often ever, anywhere, at any stage ever in our life have rents gone down? So I don't actually think anything is going to solve that problem. The only thing that seems to want to solve that problem would be things like a universal basic income, perhaps for students, raising the minimum wage so people can afford those rents.
Well, exactly. These are the sort of ideas I'm looking for.
But let me say
or the market collapses and
But if the market collapses, I don't think that's going to change rent that much. I mean, market's collapsing 10 to 20% right now, fixing whatever, and people still need a place to live. And there's still only a certain number of places to live and more people that want to rent them. So I don't know if that's necessarily the answer either.
Yeah.
Sorry, go.
I'm not clued up on economy. It's one of my weak points. But I just know that the rent going up as it does
Yep.
is I don't understand. There's no more costs for my landlord. I don't understand why he can charge me that much more money every year. It's
Well, he can
because the
charge you
bank's
whatever.
told him. It's
Well, he
because the
can charge
bank's
you
told him
whatever.
his house is suddenly worth, another
Yeah.
10 grand just magically, right? I think
No.
that's whatever that is, and I don't know what's going on, but whatever that is, that sounds horrible. Like that's a
So-
horrible system.
So let me tell you the answer to your question. He can charge you that because he owns the house, and if you don't want it, he'll find someone else. Now, so I think there's more of a moral
Well,
question.
yeah, I get that.
Yeah, but that's why. I mean, but there's a moral question as to why he'd do that. So why would a landlord do that? Is it just pure greed? But how he can do it is because he owns the property, and if he can get that much money for it, he does. And it's an icky capitalist system for people who are stuck in that cycle. But that's the reason. I want to ask this question as well, though. And George, you and I are of a different age gap, and so we went to university at different times. So I went to university in the late 90s. I can remember having no money left at the end of the week based on my living expenses. And I'm not trying to minimize what's going on now, but they were talking about, 2/3 of their income on food and rent. I can remember having 0 of my income left at the end of the week. I can remember with flatmates having Milo on toast because we literally had no money for food. So Milo on toast was what we were eating. I don't want to minimize what they're going through now. But the comment
It's
from
exactly the same.
But the comment from the person who was the student representative said, why should we allow people to live in poverty? Now, I agree that it's not necessarily a rite of passage that we all have to do, but it does feel a little bit, I don't want to disagree with the sentiment of people struggling to live, but does feel like maybe a little element of entitlement at the moment that we're owed and we're due. And I know that I experienced it. I don't know if you experienced it when you were a student, George, that there was no money there either. Now, does that mean we need to solve the problem now going forward? I'm totally fine with that. But Chloe Swarbrick saying that it's never been as bad as this. I'd like to see the metrics on that. I'd like to see what that means because, yeah, I didn't have 1/3 of my money at the end of the week when I was a student to spend on other things. I had nothing.
That's just anecdotal evidence, Pat. You'll have to look at the
doesn't
numbers.
necessarily represent the data. But what I'm saying is my story of Milo on toast was not uncommon when I was at university. Okay, so here's the question. How is it different now financially?
Here's where I stand. I understand there's a risk of romanticizing, the critique they made, the risk of romanticizing the being in poverty and that sort of thing. I do I wouldn't romanticize it, but I see it. I think if people haven't lived in poverty, then they develop a different outlook on life. I do believe that, but also that doesn't mean that I don't think everyone has a right to housing, food, blah blah blah, all the rest of it. And also that lots of these students aren't on the student allowance because of the mean testing, so they're borrowing the money for that and working and trying to get a degree. The whole university system's funny because you pay fees and it's like this weird transaction where they give you a piece of paper and you don't actually learn, and it's all fucked.
Yeah. Crazy asked me what was my student loan. Well, Crazy, I've still got one, so it was big enough to still have one 25 years after leaving university. So there you go. So no one can say to me, "Oh yeah, but you didn't have the same student loans, Mum." Technically, I've still got a student loan.
You're a young fella.
All right. Hey, we're leaving it there because if we don't, I'm going to be here by myself at 11:30 playing out an interview from Michael Woodhouse. But it feels like there's more to get onto there. In that conversation as well. I'm assuming you're heading off now, George, seeing we're going into a pre-record?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll catch you
in the background
probably tomorrow night. We'll see you at some point, sometime.
Yes, Tuesday. Yep.
And as for everybody else, former Minister of the Crown, he was Immigration Minister, current Opposition MP, Dunedin local as well. Michael Woodhouse talking about the inflation announcement today and some other things as well. If you want to comment on this, you can still comment. You can still put it up there, and if it works, I can happily to kind of put it across as we're talking about it. But I'll see you guys after this conversation to wrap up the show. Michael Woodhouse. Hey, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it because, we're just a little pissant show in the bottom of the South Island, but we like talking interesting things and we have interesting people on, and I'm glad we're finally being able to connect with someone from National to come have a chat with us from the perspective of the world from a national, point of view, so to speak.
Oh, very welcome, and from small acorns, big oaks grow. So you never know where you might be in a couple of years.
Fingers crossed, yeah. I want to know from you. I want to talk a little bit about inflation. And I guess we talk about it. So this show, which you don't know anything about, which is all good, is sort of a news conversation show. So there's often 2, sometimes 3 of us on for an hour talking around the issues of the day, bringing up news items, talking to them, playing clips, saying, what did we think about that? That's sort of what we do. It's always fun to have a politician on. We had David Clark on last week talking about the grocery commissioner. We've had Martima on a few times. And because then we can say to you guys directly, rather than us commentating it, from the halls of power, so to speak, or the crossbenches of power, whichever the case may be. What does it mean? So I want to talk to you about inflation. Of course, there was an announcement today, New Zealand at 7.3%. Nicola Willis has come out saying inflation has now had a grip on the economy and the government needs a long-term plan, not a band-aid solution to fight inflation. So the obvious question to a National Party MP is, what should if you were in the halls of power, if you were on the 9th floor, what would the long-term plan be? What could we expect from a national government acknowledging we're only really 14 months out from making that decision?
Yeah. Well, look, the government needs to make that decision now, because what we do know is that any long-term plan takes about 18 months to bed in, particularly when you're dealing with cost of living and inflation issues. So they do need to act. It's too late to say, well, they should have been doing a few of these things a year ago. But inflation primarily exists because there's not enough stuff and people are having to pay more for it. It's a simple supply and demand equation.
Right.
And one of the biggest issues with suppliers, with people, we just don't have enough skilled labor to be able to meet the demand for an economy that, despite the challenges we've got, is actually bouncing along in a simmering way. It's if you think about our construction sector, hospitality, now that the borders are reopened, there is a high level of demand for labour, for people. And the government has steadfastly refused to calibrate its immigration policy to enable the sort of labour that business needs to come in. As a consequence, we're seeing 10, 11, 12% increases in salaries for those staff. Now, if you're one of those staff, that's great. But those very same people are having to pay significantly more at the petrol pump, at the supermarket, and in their rental and mortgage. So it becomes a vicious cycle of pay increases and then cost increases and then pay increases again. And that's what worries me, that we're actually starting to get into that vicious cycle. The other thing the government can do is to turn down its own spending tap. It has, through COVID, and using the guise of COVID, frankly, spent an inordinate amount of money over the last 2 years that it claims was necessary to maintain the economy. Well, in some ways that's true, particularly when it comes to the wage subsidies that were necessary to sustain jobs, and good on them, that was the right thing to do. But amongst the more than $60 billion of extra spending that they've undertaken over the last couple of years is billions and billions of dollars of spending that by any measure can't be related to COVID. We're seeing that plus a very big increase of about 15,000 in bureaucrats in Wellington that hasn't added to a single extra teacher or undertaken a single elective surgery. So a lot of that spending can be tapered off as well. So there's a lot the government can be doing. It seems steadfastly of the view that their way is the only way. We disagree.
Okay. Great. Now let's get into some of these things and break them down a bit further that you had mentioned. I was jotting away. One of the things we don't do here, Michael, is we don't like to, unless you're, and this is not because it was him, but unless you're David Seymour and you've got a plane to catch, might have to cut in a few times then, but I want to give you the chance to share your answers in full. And then as long as you're cool with it, we go back and we have a look at it. So you talked about supply and demand, and you talked about then basically workers. So what I hear you saying is, there's not enough workers, hence supply and demand, that's driving inflation. And then you said, and then they're paying more at the petrol pump. Just that one point there. Can you explain to me how, I'm sure you know it, we all know it well, Belmac number 7 up there in Roseland or something like that, is struggling to get staff. How does that change the price, or how does that cause the price at the pumps to go up? Because you've connected those two things, and I'm just wondering how they're connected.
Well, labour is a part of any supply of a good or service, right? So yes, we talk about the price of a barrel of oil. Indeed, that's actually come down from about $120 down US to about $100. But that's only one component part of the retail price of fuel. The fuel itself has to be transported. So, that truck driver that's moving that fuel around the country, the person that's serving you behind the counter, the plethora of other staff that go into the preparation and delivery of any good or service around the country.
We don't have a fuel shortage, and we don't have a tanker delivery driver shortage. So I'm just wondering
how. Absolutely, we do, Pat. We
Okay.
have significant driver shortages. That's one of the reasons the sorts of items that we get are taking much longer to get to you, whether it's in the stores or delivered to your home.
Would it be fair to say, though, that we don't have a tanker driver shortage enough for petrol stations to be? I mean, I haven't seen petrol stations running out of petrol, for example. So I'm still trying to figure out how not enough people to employ changes the dollar figure at the pump, which is two things you connected before. It seems that all the petrol stations have plenty of fuel. Look, I don't disagree with you about what happened was the reason that there's such a difference between, say, 2008 and now to do with fuel prices is that when COVID came, all the fuel producers ramped down their service, ramped down their production of fuel, and they haven't increased them again. Hence, their fuel's being worth more to them per litre because there's less of it. But we don't actually have a fuel shortage per se. We're not running short on fuel. No one's running out of fuel.
If the point you're making is that there are some factors that the government does not control, I'll accept that.
Yep.
But what I'm saying is there are a heck of a lot of things that they do control.
Such as,
I talked about construction. I'll go back to the issue on construction costs. It's not just labour. I could have also added things like the supply of jib. And one of the reasons why we're so short of jib is because the government did not allow Fletchers to manufacture it during the COVID crisis, even though they believed that could be done safely. So there's a number of things that all contribute to an inflationary cycle. Some are controllable by government, some are not. What we're saying is, for the things that they do control, they should be acting in order to take the pressure off Kiwis.
They don't call it jib in America. What do they call it? Sheetrock. Or something like that. Yeah.
Drywall, Australia.
Drywall. I mean, maybe not. I'm not saying it's an exact parallel. That seems to be a worldwide issue at the moment for some reason, the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as you say, maybe there's a difference in New Zealand because we produce it here and it could have supplied here more easily. I am interested, though, as well to ask you, I think the idea of an opposition in a well-functioning democracy is to hold the government to account, right? Yep. Completely what you guys should be doing and are doing, but there's also the idea of, as a voter and a member of the public, I want to see my politicians be most effective in what they do for the betterment of me and my community, be that the country or be that my neighborhood or be that my family or whatever it is. And I wonder about like the worldwide issues. So, for example, I had a look, and I'll bring it up to show you if you like. Just before we came on, where's my little thing? Here it is. Like inflation in general, right? This is, I've got to just bring my screen up, excuse me. We can share screens here and we do this so people can see what we're talking about. Looking at inflation around the world at the moment, I think it was announced today that the UK was at 9.1%. The US is at 9.1%. The European Union's at 8.6%. Canada's at 7.7%. So on a OECD or world scale, it doesn't seem New Zealand's in a terrible place. And I'm wondering if we're seeing these things around the world, if we are, and like the sheetrock or the jib stop or the whatever, or the petrol prices everywhere being up around the world, or it being hard to find people to employ everywhere in the world, it seems to be an issue for places that don't have to have an international flight to get here, like the countries within the European Union. And I guess I'm kind of throwing it back to you. You've started the conversation about what this government can do, but if these are things that we're seeing around the world, if National was in, for example, what is it that you could actually change within the country that's not being seen as a trend around the world? Australia at the moment at 5.1%, but they say that's going to be going up in a couple of months. That's from a March figure. What actually, there's an economist who also says that I was going to play a little clip of, but I couldn't find the clip from News Hub, who says the main people responsible for inflation is the Reserve Bank. And one of the things they did was 18 months ago, they actually projected there'd be more unemployed people than there are. And that's also one of the driving factors of inflation. So I want to hear, and I'm not challenging you in this way, solutions to us.
Raise the whole, well, I'll try and encapsulate that in three sort of key areas.
Yeah, go for it.
Two relating to the rest of the world and one relating to our own Reserve Bank. So firstly, the fact that our government may be following the same bad policies of other Western jurisdictions is not a reason to say, you know, things could not be better. Actually, they can be better. And I think Australia is a good example of where they, because I'm not sure I agree with you that Australia will get to the sort of UK and US sorts of levels of inflation. I'm also not convinced that we couldn't. Now, experts came out to say today 7.3, we may be reaching the apex of the inflationary curve. I'm not convinced. I think the conditions for greater levels of inflation still exist, and we can have a chat in about 6 to 9 months' time to see who's right there. But I do agree with you that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has acted, in my view, too slowly to manage inflation back down. And the things that they're seeing now with the official cash rate going up will have an effect, but as I say, it could take 18 months to come through. I was on the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee last year, and we heard from Adrian Orse in successive monetary policy statements projecting that, you know, at that time it was 2.7%, that he reckoned it was going to be transitory and low, basically outside the 1 to 3% range, but nevertheless short term, and we'd get back into that range. We're not. And they're now telling a different story. I think the OCR should have gone up higher sooner.
Yep.
But as I said at the start, I think that's basically, we're looking over our shoulder, and to be fair to the Reserve Bank, they're also acting now, seeing the sorts of pressures and 2 or 3 successive quite significant increases in the official cash rate have happened. The last thing I'd say about the Reserve Bank, though, is that the government made it very clear that inflation was not their only problem to solve. They specifically gave them employment and maximum sustainable employment as a specific goal of the Reserve Bank. And many economic commentators will say that they are somewhat incompatible in the short term. One does have to give way to the other. And so if we have had that overcooked employment market, then that was going to have an inflationary pressure that the Reserve Bank were going to struggle to contain. That was true. Now, the question then becomes is, in their efforts to contain inflation, will that result in a higher level of unemployment? Probably at the margins, yes. But if you're going to do the interest rate controls, increasing them to control inflation, now is the best time to do it when we've got a really overcooked economy and high demand for labour, so that if somebody is unfortunate enough to lose their job, they are most likely to be able to walk into another one pretty quickly.
Nicola Willis was talking this morning, I guess she was doing the rounds, but on one of the TV shows about, and I mean, it's a phrase that we're hearing from national MPs at the moment about, you know, this government being addicted to spending, et cetera, and talking about spending less. I mean, that means cuts or to cancel future spending. What would you guys do? I mean, what needs to be taken away?
Yeah.
In other words, what spending would you take away that the government's either doing now or is projected to do?
Well, so firstly, I don't accept the portrayal of what we are saying. It doesn't mean cuts. What the government may say is cuts in real terms, which means that inflation is so out of control now that to maintain spending in real terms, they're going to have to increase all public spending by at least 7.3%. So firstly, we get inflation under control. Therefore, that pressure is not as high. But secondly, there are a number of areas of spending where we can avoid them. I think we've seen 15,000 extra public servants in Wellington, the only place where rents aren't, or house prices aren't dropping in the way they are around the country, is in Wellington because CBD, because there's such a high demand for that property. And a lot of that's being driven by bureaucrats. Now, just to give you a simple example, the New Zealand Transport Authority has gone from about 1,200 to about 1,700 staff. Very little output for that. The Ministry of Health, at a time when they're actually being dismantled and turned into a policy unit, they've gone from 1,200 to 1,900 staff.
Sorry, not to interrupt you. Can I just ask you a quick question? I don't want to interrupt.
Sure.
But when you say there's no outcome, I mean, Mr. Luxon has said that quite a bit about the health system. And then the government has come back and say, well, look at all these markers. When you say that, what are your metrics for saying?
Well, what are those markers? Okay. Because our metrics are people and people getting care, right? Now, we believed in the key English government, we were of the view in health, for example, that outputs were correlated with outcomes. If you have higher levels of immunisation of our children, where they went from 63 to 92%, then that can be correlated with better outcomes in terms of the likelihood that they're going to get those diseases, particularly diseases of poverty. If you immunise against rheumatic fever, if you make homes warmer and drier, which we did under the Warm Up New Zealand Heat Smart program, then you're going to have lower levels of those sorts of diseases of low income. If you have people waiting in the emergency department for less than 6 hours, you're going to save about 700 lives a year. If you start cancer treatment within 4 weeks of a definitive diagnosis, the likelihood of an outcome is going to be better. So we had those markers, we had those targets. Now the Labor government didn't like them. It said they were the wrong sorts of targets and they got rid of them. But what they didn't do was replace them with any quantifiable output or outcome measures. And as a consequence, in my view, the health sector has drifted. Despite a shed load of money going into it, we're having significant staffing shortages and we're having longer wait times, cancelled surgeries, some of which I do accept as part of COVID. Yeah. But the health system is under a tremendous amount of pressure, and in large part because they lack direction. Now, one of the things that we wouldn't be doing right now is a major restructure of the health system. We think this is tin-eared and poor timing. Are you
talking about DHBs coming into one?
Disappearing into one.
You'd leave the DHBs, that you'd let them operate as they're currently operating now? You wouldn't try and improve or not improve, you just leave them alone?
Yes, no, we would improve, there's no doubt, but this isn't the way. It seems to me that whatever the problem is, the answer is Wellington. And that's where we fundamentally disagree with the Labor Party and the left.
Well, what I hear you saying is that you're disagreeing on the way to do it. You want to improve it as well. You do it a different way from how they're wanting to improve it. So you're disagreeing not on the change, on the idea to change. You're disagreeing on how to change.
The need for some change in our health system was clear.
Yeah.
Throwing the whole model out and saying Wellington will control everything was not an answer that we would have come up with. Same with the polytechs. You know, we have 16 polytechs around the country. 2 of them are the exemplars of academic and financial success. That's Otago Polytech and the Southern Institute of Technology. Instead of using them as the exemplars, this government spent $250 million merging them all together so that everybody can lose money, not just a few of them. I mean, that was really bad, a really bad idea. And so what worries me is there's a lot of money being spent on reform, but it's not reform that's actually improving outcomes. And that's part of the spending that we think can be avoided.
Would it be fair to say, and I'm actually not challenging you on that, you're entitled to say that, but would it be fair to say you won't know if they're improving outcomes in the Polytech one for several years because it's just happened? Would that be a fair thing to at least put out there?
Certainly, I would accept that a number of these major reforms would take some time to bed in, but what we wouldn't expect to see is a dramatic shift backwards in the sort of things that are happening. So this is an example of, you know, a justification for the health reforms. But actually, we've spent 4.5 years drifting backwards in terms of those key measures of the health of New Zealanders. And then to then go, right, the solution to that is more reform, the biggest structural reform we've had in the health sector in probably 40 years, much less 20. We wouldn't expect, while we may not see all of the benefit, we shouldn't be seeing the interim harm that I think is being caused to things like waiting times for important treatments.
Right. Obviously 7.3 today for inflation. Do you have an idea, like like, it's a bit of a silly question, but I'm talking about, like, I love radio and I love radio ratings. And we had a conversation around Today FM last week, and it was like, I was saying to some of the guys, what would you be happy with? What percentage for your first survey would you be happy with? What do you think would be, looking at the world at the moment and acknowledging that there's some things the government can't do, what do you think would be a fair inflation rate? Like that National would be going, hey, this is pretty good. What would that number be for you guys, like right now?
Well, it would be at the higher end of the 1 to 3% rate for domestic inflation. Now,
so hang on. So you think fair would be about 3%? Like that would be National would there be no peeps about it if it was at 3%, like nowhere else in the world at the moment?
Well, so firstly, you have to distinguish. I'll just go on and explain what I mean by that. Then we'll have that conversation. Because the RBNZ are judged not so much on the overall headline inflation number. And you may have heard over the last couple of days discussion being had about the difference between the tradable inflation and the non-tradable inflation. So generally non-tradable is the internal service sector, not exported, stuff like that. The tradable stuff is our imports, inflationary pressure on our imports. And that's the stuff that the government will say is not controllable. Well, in terms of the way we measure that, the 1 to 3% range that the RBNZ are judged on is judged on the domestic side, the non-tradable inflation.
So fuel wouldn't come into that.
We want to get under control first. And I think that's still achievable. It's their legal range. It's the obligation the Reserve Bank Act requires them in the long run to achieve. And I think we can. But as I say, that's probably going to take 18 months. And it's going to take a couple of things. It's going to take controls on spending, either increases in the supply of the products or decreases in demand for them, products and labour, and the government to taper off its crazy spending program right now. When those three things happen in an 18 months time frame, I think we can get non-tradable inflation back to that 3% range. Now, I'm a little bit more maudlin on that. I don't see that happening. While experts are saying that our overall inflation rate is probably peaking up around the mid sevens, I don't know if the conditions don't exist that mean we might not follow the UK and the US into higher territory.
I'm just Googling as you're talking because I don't know what the tradable inflation rate is. So what is that domestic inflation rate in New Zealand at the moment? So not the 7.3.
5.3, I think 5.4. So it was lower than the headline number.
So if you'd like to work a couple of percentage points off. So if the overall inflation, including what the international thing was about what Australia is now, National would be quite happy with that.
Yes. Well, no. Well, what I'll say is, if what could also happen, which the government wouldn't be able to take credit for, because they certainly haven't, they've used this as the defence, is, if things do settle down in the Ukraine, if oil supplies and grain supplies start to level off, if our shipping comes back to the level of capacity that we had pre-COVID, if COVID goes away, if all of those things happen, then we'll probably get back to a headline inflation number, probably over 3, but not that much over 3. I mean, there's a lot of variables in that, but the point is, what the government controls, it should be doing more about.
So when you say headline, just to make sure, headline is including the international, not just the trade.
That's right.
Okay. Yep. So, and then this is a silly thing, and don't worry, I'm not being for real here, Michael, but we're both Dunedinites and we live locally, and let's say you guys get in next year and you guys are the government.
Yeah.
At what point am I allowed to say to you in our conversation when you come on again? Now, you said to me looking for around that 3 to 4% headline. At what point am I able to hold you accountable to that after you get in next October?
Probably between 18 months and 2 years after we're able to make the sort of decisions that we should be making. Okay. And that would probably include the first budget. So let's start the clock at budget 2024.
Okay.
And then, so, it is a long game, and we could be having a conversation probably in the last quarter of 2025, when we should be saying, right, government spending is under control. The Reserve Bank is taking a more normative approach to monetary policy with I was going to say loosened immigration policy. I don't think that's what we're talking about. and as the former Minister of Immigration of nearly 5 years, I'm pretty tuned in with this. When we have immigration policy that's calibrated to demand, so when demand drops, immigration drops. When demand increases, immigration increases. At the same time as we train and recruit as many Kiwis as we can and give them a reason to stay in New Zealand. When we've got those things happening, I think you'll see a much more stable and steady inflation picture.
So just to wrap up, thank you for giving us some time tonight. Really appreciate it talking to you. Hopefully we'll be able to talk again in the future. What I hear you saying is we're not doing cuts. We're just not going to adjust to inflation the amount we're spending like Labor is.
Yeah, that's pretty much a summary.
Okay, so that therefore means that some things may go backwards, because if you're not keeping up with inflation, they may not keep up with that. That's fair, and that's so it's not a. You're saying it's not a cut, but it's not keeping up with that same spending. So you'd spend less.
And in challenged economic times, we've done that before with significantly positive outcomes. But I think the key to that is to set very clear expectations for outcomes in health, in educational achievement, in law and order, in repeat violent offending, the sorts of things that we saw between 08 and 17, or at least in the first 6 years of those. We were able to do quite a bit with pretty meager increases in the various votes. So, and you could take them, so some's not controllable, like social welfare, obviously, to the degree that we don't control the number of people who retire at the age of 65. Obviously, we've talked about raising that. But broadly speaking, if we increase spending, but not by the rate that Labor would, and we'll never win a spending contest with Labor, then the other side of that coin is to be able to say, okay, we want you to do more with the funds that you get, and here are the objective measures of success for that. We'll be ruthless about that.
When you say spend more with the funds that you get, I mean, on some level, that does relate me to a couple of little wrap-ups for us. Is I think Nicola Willis talked about, or the article I'm reading on stuff says National wants tax cuts. That's that same policy of tax cuts. Now, normally with tax cuts, I guess what you're saying is if you don't spend the same amount as Labor's going to spend, that's absorbable, because normally with tax cuts, if you're going to spend the same amount, you therefore need to cut elsewhere or borrow. So are you cutting, i.e. this and not spending to inflation, or are you borrowing to pay for these tax cuts?
Well, the question, and I don't want to assume this is your view, but the question could be interpreted as saying, if tax cuts occur, then by necessity, the government has less in the coffers. I contest that. Tax cuts generally go to three things. People either retire debt, save it, or spend it. And the sorts of tax threshold changes that we are talking about will be targeted very much at the people who are most likely to spend it, not save it. So that does have a stimulatory effect on the economy. That means the government actually gets income back from that. The biggest beneficiaries, by the way, of the situation we have at the moment are the Treasury and the Minister of Finance, who've taken billions of dollars of extra tax in because of the inflationary environment we find ourselves in. So, but the tax threshold changes are not necessarily a net cost on the Crown. By the way, it's your money, right? So when you pay it, you should expect from your government that it only takes as little as possible from you in order to be able to maintain the services. The last thing I would say about that is in the spending side. I'll tell you a story that will illustrate the point. When I was Minister of Police in 2015, we opened a collaboration with Vodafone, and we gave police mobile devices. First time that all had iPhones and iPads. And then through a development hub in Newtown in Wellington, they developed things that prevented sworn officers on the beat from having to go back to their stations and write tickets and write reports and do a pile of paperwork that they had previously needed to do. That initiative saved 1.2 million hours of police time every year. That's the equivalent of putting 600 sworn officers on the beat, which is exactly how the dividend was paid. They didn't lose money, they gained hours. Now, that's just one small example of how smart government, smart public policy actually gets a better outcome for the taxpayer. This idea that the only way to get good out is to pour lots of money in, I think needs to be challenged. And when Andrew Little said that last year, I don't know why the health sector isn't doing better. We've put so much money in. For me, illustrates the point. Government's harder than just money. If it was as simple as that, we'd have solved it years ago. It actually needs a smart government sector, public sector, thinking about innovative ways to do better with the money that they get.
Listen, I've from this last 3 minutes, there's about another hour I want to talk to you about. So maybe we can book in to have a chat because, in the future, because you talked about, giving tax cuts to those who need it most. But, when those were, not that they were announced, it's not a policy, but, I remember some uncomfortable conversations with Mr. Luxon about how much he'd get back in his pocket versus, a beneficiary. And it seems that the majority of the money was going to people who didn't need to spend it as opposed to those who did. But I guess I don't really want to, that would be another 40-minute conversation, Michael, and I don't want to hold you up.
One I'd love to have as a licensed accountant. I have very strong views about that. And, in a progressive tax system, the reality is you can't give a tax cut to everyone without giving it to people who pay the most and earn the most. So we'll have that conversation another day.
Well, I mean, you could, in theory. You could, in theory. You could not. You could choose to not change it for the top rate if you wanted to. I'm not suggesting anyone would do that, but in theory, you could do that. It's possible.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
It depends what you mean by the top rate, because
rates.
Yeah, I mean,
like if you only gave it to people earning under 30, like literally only gave it to people earning under, say, $50,000, then you wouldn't be giving it to the top earners. I mean, you'd be giving it to the first 50,000 they earned, but you wouldn't be giving them to the higher thresholds.
But the problem with that, Pat, is that every single income earner earns that first $50,000.
Sure.
So because of the progressive tax system we have, you are giving a tax cut to people who earn a lot more money than maybe you and I do. So
and look, and I'm not suggesting that's what any political party would do.
That's a whole other conversation I look forward to having.
Yeah. Finally, so you've mentioned 2 to 20 times in this conversation, just joking, about the number of bureaucrats going up. So we can expect National to cut back on the number of bureaucrats, or will you leave it as it is and there'll be a natural attrition, or will there be 15,000 in, so those people get their CVs ready?
I don't think we would lose that many, but I don't think I'm convinced we can run Wellington on fewer than we've got now.
And the final question is, you've talked about rent several times. Mr. Luxon was asked about this a couple of months ago. We've been doing this for about 3.5 months now. I was right back at the start when he said $50 a week. I think it's more like $100 a week now. It's jumped up that much in that time period. And he was asked then something that I want to ask you now, which is, acknowledging that it's gone up, what would you then do to either reduce that rate, that rent, or I guess enable the person to earn another $50 to $100 a week so it offsets their rent? What would the policy will be developed next year, but we will be looking at easing some of the things that we believe drove rental increases from landlords last year and this year. And one of the significant ones was the Bright Line test going out to 10 years, which is effectively the capital gains tax that the Prime Minister said she would resign before she did. Well, given that most houses are flipped in 7 years, that means a significant portion of all houses that aren't the first home are going to be subject to a marginal capital gains tax. So remember that most countries around the world only have a 15% or so capital gains. For many landlords, that would be 33 or 39%. So it's much more punitive than the countries with whom the Labor government compared and said we wouldn't do that. If a landlord is looking for a rate of return, there's 2 ways they can do that. It's either on capital growth or on income. If they can't get it from capital growth, it's going to be on income. And effectively, that the capital framework we had was subsidising rents. That subsidy was removed, in my view, by the imposition of the capital gains tax the government put in through the Bright Line test, and rents went up. All right, listen, I can feel us. We'll have to get together and have a coffee one day somewhere around Dunedin and keep going. But I'd love to talk to you again within the next 12 months. It's great to have you on. It's good to have your perspective. I do appreciate you giving us some time. The Honourable Michael Woodhouse. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Pleasure. Thanks, mate.
Alrighty, Mighty. Yeah, it's interesting listening back to something that you've already done, and it always happens when you do interviews. You kind of go, "Oh, I wish I had said. Oh, I wish I had said." I think the point I was trying to make about the tax. This is me explaining it, which means my narrative, what I said wasn't quite right. Exactly what I talked about earlier with Mr. Luxon having to explain what he said. But actually, I think it was clear what I was saying. But I think the idea of everyone getting a tax break under $50,000 does give the super wealthy tax breaks, but only for the first $50,000, not for the $100,000, $200,000, $500,000, $1 million, which means, yeah, they'd get the $50 a week as well that you'd hope everyone else could get, but they wouldn't get the $5,000 a week in their upper echelons. So I don't know if that was missed or it was purposely not done or whatever. Look, tons of questions and comments been coming in as well. Interesting from Crazy. Crazy says I'd rate him over Luxon. All right. A couple of people really getting into the conversation. So there might be several people here having multiple comments, but I like to try and acknowledge what you guys have done and said about. I'd say that that he addressed the aspect of the RBNZ over predicting unemployment numbers by complaining that the RBNZ has to try to address unemployment in the first place, which is tangential at best, and trying to steal $20 million off Southland Polytech. He is wrong on DHBs. We need to rationalize the management of them and implement a national health computer system. Only then can streamlining of resources begin. Here's one thing I don't really understand about, again, perhaps it's a juxtaposition, but I think of an American example better actually, because when Trump was in, Republicans were running the place. Republicans are the conservative, the politicians that are for business, right? They think they do business better, just like National Enact here in New Zealand. Yet they would not allow the government didn't go in to buy PPE, right? Now, when COVID kicked in and the government didn't go in and spend $1 trillion on PPE or whatever America would have to spend, instead what they did was they allowed their states to stay independent. And then what you had is California bidding against Texas for the PPE, driving the price up. Whereas it seems to me that a better business decision would have been to have a consolidated fund through the government, because that's just local government, California versus Texas or whatever. A better business decision would have been to have a consolidated fund. That means none of the states are competing with each other, which means you can drive the price down, not drive the price out. And if you're ordering $1 trillion of something rather than, 100 million, then you're going to get a better price per unit. So I think about things like the DHB and Three Waters and that kind of thing. From a business perspective, what National's saying is this government can't run it in their bureaucracy. They don't trust their bureaucracy. But I kind of feel like from a business point of view, like Three Waters is a good example. If you can then take I think it's going to be 3 entities under one heading to now drive prices down for all the pipes that need to be replaced around the country, rather than every individual council having to bid to get those pipes put in, surely that's a better business decision. But it's not going to be a business because it's going to be run as a public entity. I don't know. I think that idea of, supply and demand, we talked about supply and demand in that conversation. If we can create more, if we can control the supply and the demand as a council or as a bigger entity and drive the price down, then that helps us as the people paying for it, being ratepayers in this instance or whatever. And I wondered the same about the DHBs and the Polytechs. I have to be honest, I'm not too up to date with what's happening with those things, but is there a better line for, they're talking like National is talking about too many bureaucrats, yet they want to keep more DHB employees. Surely if you want fewer bureaucrats, a centralized system would be better to run the group than a whole bunch of groups. Do you know what I mean? So it seems, I don't know whether it's just my brain seeing a juxtaposition, whether there actually is one, because a centralized position would seem to need fewer people to run it than lots of little ones. National is saying there's too many bureaucrats, we've got to get rid of them, but we're not going to do that for the DHBs or the Polytechs. We're going to keep them with as many bureaucrats, workers as possible. I don't know. It seems inconsistent to me in the messaging. But then I could actually say that we're maybe I'm missing something there, to be honest. Why do people keep acting like SIT, Southern Institute of Technology, is so bloody great? It survived on massive capital investment from a private investor and the local council. Bet the others would do better with that sort of money. And for people who don't know, they have their zero fees, don't they? So people go to SIT for nothing. I don't know if it's for all courses, but for some courses. Small economies like ours tend to be at the extremes of percentage comparisons. We'll end up being amongst the lowest of the highest rate of inflation, unlikely to rest in the middle. Another one here as well. Also, the money SIT had in reserve will stay in their region. It just changes who decides on how it's spent in the same area. I guess you guys with some knowledge here are talking about SIT having $20 million in reserves, and that's how they pay for everything. $20 million in reserve, that's probably a couple of $1 million a year just in interest alone, I'm guessing. I think we're pretty much done. There's more comments coming in. I thank you for those. Yeah, look, I mean, what we do here sometimes is a bit of a stream of consciousness. I'm kind of thinking this out as I'm here. So this is not a well-prepared, polished kind of commentary, based on, writing an article and then editing it. But I'm just thinking out loud, and that's kind of what we're going to do. That's kind of what we are, which is why I think of this as more of a news conversation than a news show. It might sound a bit wanky to you using the word conversation, but a news conversation, because I'm thinking now about how you'd run business and how you'd consolidate business and how you'd function better and lower your costs. And a centralized group seems to make sense, but National is rallying against centralized groups when it comes to Three Waters and the Polytechs and the DHBs. But they want fewer bureaucrats. That, to me, for the very first time I've thought about it, so I could be wrong, I'll have to think some more, seems to be a bit of a juxtaposition, seems to be inconsistent. You either want centralized groups, fewer bureaucrats to run out of an area or a smaller group, or you want, every DHB, every council, every whatever to be independent and separate. Seems like what they're saying is, he actually said it, we can run Wellington on fewer people. Well, why don't you want to run the DHBs on fewer people? Why don't you want to run Three Waters on fewer people? Why don't you want to run the Polytechs on fewer people? Why do you only want to run Wellington on fewer people, but not the others? I don't know. We're about to wrap up and move on, but you're welcome to share. Am I being inconsistent there, or have I seen a little something that doesn't seem right to you guys? I'll give you 30 seconds if you want to type that out and to respond to it. Have I seen a inconsistency there, or is it because we're talking about government agencies and they're different from business? I don't know. Okay, that's us. As you can see, running along the bottom of the screen there, BHN, Big Hairy, or hashtag BHN or Big Hairy News. If you look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and now Rover as well. Rover is the MediaWorks podcast platform. You'll find us the audio content. I basically get off air right now and I upload the audio straight away. So typically it's there within about 20 minutes at the end of the show, depending on when it comes through to your device. But it's also a good thing to put into your phone or whatever, subscribe to one of those feeds. And then if you do miss a show and you want to catch up with what we've been talking about the next day as you're driving to work or on the bus or on your bike or walk with the dog or whatever, you can have a listen to what we got up to just in your ears without having to look at our ugly mugs, which I know is probably more enjoyable. I was going to try and show you something as well. Check this out. I'm going to take this off. It's really weird doing this because now I can't hear myself at all. Did you know that this hat actually glows in the dark? Hang on. Stay there. Don't move. I'm going to turn my lights off. Don't move. I'm still here. I'm still here. Don't go anywhere. Turn this off. Turn this off. Check this out. This hat that I bought from America. Hang on. This is really good. There we go. Check this out. See, it actually glows. Can you see that? That's pretty cool, eh? Glows in the dark. And when it's really dark, it's the outline. The outline glows. See that? This will be really weird for the guys listening to the audio podcast. How dark is this now? Man, this is creepy. Should be my Friday night. Should be like this kind of the love songs till midnight. Hey there. Hope you're doing well with our funky lights on in the background. All right, guys. Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm still here. You probably can't see me, but I'm still here in the darkness. I will catch you tomorrow night from 10 p.m. Hopefully we'll have Jorge Thomas, the Hori, on with us as well, talking about his trip around the South Island and what they're doing with Hori's Pledge. But other than that, be safe. Wash your hands. Wear a mask if you're out in public, please. I don't want you COVID. And we will catch you tomorrow night from 10 p.m. And I might even wear my glow-in-the-dark cap again. Does it look like it's glowing? I think it probably does. All right, team. All the best. Be safe. Catch you soon.